Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all, at least virtually. This is Professor, or I should say Dr. Dunn, um, with the video lecture for today. Since I've been feeling under the weather, or have been for the last few days, and I thought it was probably not a good thing for me to expose myself to you and to people who might have compromised immune systems. So I decided to take the day off and instead to do this virtual class meeting by recording this lecture, which I will then upload later to the internet, to YouTube, so you can watch it. And then I'll be back later in this week. I should be okay because I'm feeling a lot better. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks, as they say, and continue on with our discussion of the world religion, Buddhism. Okay, let me make my self smaller so I'm not in the way. There we are. And we got our PowerPoint here, Buddhism. There we go. Let me get my notes. Let's see where we ended. I believe we just finished the history of the Buddha. The Buddha had died. There we go. Okay, he died when he was about 80. There we go. So we were here talking about the Buddha. We watched some videos and we talked about his death. Okay. And we're moving on to the Dharma. First, we started talking about the Buddha. I'll have some comments to say about the Buddha later at the end of the talk about Buddhism. I'll save those comments for later because there are different views of the Buddha depending on which kind of group of Buddhists you belong to. And it just seems logical to me that I should discuss those kinds of Buddhism first before I talk about more about who the Buddha was or is. Now we're going to talk about the Dharma, which is the teaching of the Buddha. We should be familiar with this term Dharma from Hinduism. Okay, remember Buddha was a Hindu technically because he was from India. That was his. Even though Nepal, it's the modern day country of Nepal. At the time, Nepal was not its own separate country. It's part of the Indian subcontinent, and so the cultures very much are this. I don't want to say the same, but very much influenced by the larger Indian, you could also say Hindu culture of the region. So it's not surprising that we're going to find a lot of the same ideas, the same kind of terminology that we found in Hinduism, also appearing in Buddhism, because the Buddha was a man of his people and his time and his culture. So the Dharma, but the Dharma is not exactly the same as it is in Hinduism. The Dharma, again, recall, is an elastic word. It has a lot of meanings. It can mean, it's custom and tradition and teaching and order, and it can even be applied to ritual. It has a very broad sense of meaning. Religion, when I talked about religion at the beginning of the course, I discussed the word Dharma as another way of describing religion. The order of the universe is basically what Dharma is for Hinduism. It's the innate system that makes everything work the way it does, the way it's supposed to work. I think in Christianity they may call that the natural law, or eternal law might be a better term for that. But the Dharma is a little bit different, has a different shade of meaning in Buddhism, because Dharma means primarily teaching, the teaching and way of life of the Buddha. And this is kind of similar to what we discussed in Islam, where we had the Quran. Well, I shouldn't say the Quran. Excuse me, where we have the Sunnah, rather, which contains extra teachings and example of way of life of the Prophet Muhammad for people to follow. And this is kind of a similar idea. The Dharma is the way the Buddha taught, but also the way he lived the teachings that he taught. The Buddha is not a god. The Buddha is not a god, at least not originally. Okay, in some forms of Buddhism, he kind of becomes a god, but we'll talk about that later. But really, the Buddha is not defined as a god. He's not an avatar, so he's not an appearance of a god like Vishnu appearing. Although remember, in Hinduism, the Buddha is placed as in some forms of Hinduism would regard the Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu, but for Buddhists he is not. He's not a savior or a redeemer. He's not snatching us from the fires of hell or, saving us from our sins, cleansing our sins. And he was not a theologian. Okay, he didn't like to talk about the gods very much. He didn't deny the existence of the gods, that there were deities, both good and bad, um, or that there were ghosts or things like that. But they were not. They were questions of ambivalence to the Buddha. They did not concern the Buddha because um, they didn't really affect the person in his or her pursuit of enlightenment. They had their own paths which they had to follow, and then the human person had his or her path that he or she had to follow. So he was not really a theologian either. What is the Buddha then? Well, to find out what he is, we should look at how he describes himself. And I didn't mention this in class last time, but I wanted to mention it now before I forget. And I'll write it here in this Word file that I have open. If I can get it open, get it to work for me. Hold on a second here. Okay. Alrighty. Thought I had prepared this before, but apparently not, so I apologize for that. The most common term or title that the Buddha applies to himself is Tathagata, this word which might come from Sanskrit. Scholars aren't exactly sure which language it comes from. It could come from Sanskrit, but it might not. And if it doesn't, then it might have a different meaning. And even if it came from Sanskrit, it's kind of an ambiguous term and hard to translate. But the way I would translate it from what I read is the one who has come and gone. The one who has come and gone, or the one who is both coming and going at the same time. You're both coming and going at the same time. That kind of dual reality. But there are a variety of ways to translate this. In some ways, it's the one who's come. In some ways, it's the one who's gone. But it seems to have that dualistic meaning of one who's both coming and going. Okay, and that is the title actually that the Buddha uses to describe himself most often. It's not the Buddha. He doesn't walk around saying, "Oh well, the Buddha this and the Buddha that." He describes himself as, "I am Tathagata. I am the one who has come and the one who is gone." And if you want to think about it in a certain way, or a way to help you think about it and the kind of the weirdness of the term, think about yourself here. I'm sitting here in my chair in my home, but I'm on planet Earth. Okay, which is moving. Okay, the Earth is spinning on its axis, but it's also orbiting around the sun, and the sun itself is a star which is moving through the universe, the Milky Way universe, our galaxy, through our Milky Way galaxy, and our galaxy is moving through the universe. So I'm not really stationary. You could say that I am both coming and going at the same time. I'm sitting here, I'm in a way stationary, but I'm also moving at the same time. Even though, you don't see me moving. I seem to be, if I ask you, am I sitting in one place? You'd say, yeah, that's how I appear to be. But the reality we know is that I'm not. None of us is. We're all on a planet which is itself moving, which is itself revolving, which is itself orbiting with us in a planetary system which is moving through a galaxy. The whole thing's moving, and then our galaxy is all moving. We're always in movement. We're never just standing still, even though it appears as such. So think of it kind of like that way. Think of when you regard the ambiguity of this title, Tathagata. It's kind of like the same thing. You're both coming and going at the same time, or you've both arrived and departed at the same time. Okay. Anyways, okay. So that's the most common epithet that the Buddha uses for himself, the Tathagata. But he describes himself as well, and he describes himself in this story called the parable of the arrow. And a parable is simply a story with a lesson. It's very simply put, it's a story with a lesson. And in it, the Buddha describes what he sees his role as. And in the parable of the arrow, in this story, one of his disciples comes to the Buddha and complains to him. He's not satisfied with the Buddha because he came to the Buddha seeking answers to his questions. Okay, questions about, is there a God or are there gods? Is there a soul? Does the soul exist forever? Is there an afterlife? And this disciple, whose name is Malunkyaputta, or Malunkyaputta, you could say as well, but Malunkyaputta, whoops, nice if I could spell, Malunkyaputta is complaining to the Buddha. I came to you for answers to these things, and I've been a disciple for so long, and I'm not getting my answers. I'm not getting my questions answered. So he complains, and the Buddha responds basically saying like, well, what do you expect from me? What did you expect? That's not my role. Okay, and the Buddha kind of says to Malunkyaputta that the questions you're asking about God or the soul or the afterlife are really irrelevant to reaching enlightenment. And the Buddha describes his role not as to be a question-answer man, or some holy wise man who's going to reveal all the secrets of the universe, but he explains his role as a physician, as a doctor. The Buddha says that he's like a physician who is asked to treat a person who has been struck by a poisoned arrow, hence the parable of the arrow. And the Buddha comes along as a physician to diagnose the problem and then treat the illness, to remove the arrow and to neutralize the poison. That's the job of the physician. The job of the physician is not to answer all sorts of questions. If the person who was struck with the arrow started saying, well, how did it get there? And who shot it? And how long is the arrow? And all these questions, these are not relevant. These are unimportant to the doctor's main task, which is to save the patient. So neither the doctor nor the patient are concerned about all these things. You don't ask a lot of questions. You treat the patient that you have in front of you. And it's the same. This is the Buddha's response to Malunkyaputta, that you're asking me all these questions that you want answered when they're actually irrelevant to the process of enlightenment. They're unimportant to my main task, which is to act as a physician, that is to cure you of your delusions. And I have a quote from, this statement in the Hebrew, in the Buddhist scriptures from the Sutta Pitaka. We'll learn later what the Sutta Pitaka is, in the section called the Majjhima Nikaya. I think that means the greater discourses. I think they're organized within the scriptures, the sacred writings, according to length. So there are middle discourses, longer discourses, all sorts of stuff. Number 63. So here is a selection from this conversation that Malunkyaputta has with him. And this is the Buddha's response. It is as if a man had been wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions, his relatives and kinsfolk, were to procure for him a physician. And the sick man were to say, I will not have this arrow taken out until I have learned whether the man who wounded me belonged to the warrior caste, or to the Brahmin caste, or to the agricultural caste, or to the menial caste, etc., etc., etc. Or again, he were to say, I will not have this arrow taken out until I have learned whether the man who wounded me was tall, or short, or of the middle height. Or again, he were to say, I will not have this arrow taken out until I have learned whether the man who wounded me was from this or that village, or town, or city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on like this, okay? The discourse, it's just this is kind of like a way, a stereotypical way that these discourses kind of go. It seems to me, from the little I've read, that there's a lot of repetitiveness. The person repeats over and over just to make the point. All these things over and over and over again. Okay, to the point where you say, at least for me as the reader, okay, okay, Buddha, I get the point. Can we move on, please? But you just gotta have to go with it. Anyways, so I've edited a lot of this repetitiveness out. But he goes on, or again he were to say this, or again he were to say that, or again he were to say, and then finally we get to the point. Accordingly, Malunkyaputta, bear always in mind what it is that I have not elucidated and what it is that I have elucidated. Basically, what the Buddha is saying to Malunkyaputta is, I didn't promise you answers to your questions. So you got to remember what I promised you and what I didn't promise you. What I said I would tell you, what I said I wouldn't tell you. Okay? I have not elucidated that the world is eternal or that the world is not eternal. I have not elucidated that the soul and the body are identical, that the soul is one thing or the body another. I have not spelled out for you that the saint, the arhat, the one who becomes enlightened, exists after death, or that the saint does not exist after death. And what, Malunkyaputta, have I elucidated? Misery. The origin of misery have I elucidated. The cessation of misery have I elucidated. And the path leading to the cessation of misery have I elucidated. That's it. Basically, the Four Noble Truths are stated here. Actually, there's only three, but it's basically the Four Noble Truths is what he's pointing to, which we'll go back to in a moment. So this is the famous from the famous parable of the arrow, where Buddha described himself not as a savior, a god, or anything like that. He is a physician. He is a doctor who has been called to the side of a dying man, or a man who is, or woman who is deeply sick and needs the cure, and he's bringing the cure. The cure is the Dharma. Okay, his teachings. In Pali, you'll sometimes see it as Dhamma. Okay, and I forget. I have to look in the textbook which form they use, but you have to understand that in Buddhism, you're dealing here with two languages: Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit, which was the ancient language of part of India, not all of India, but it's an ancient influential language in the Hindu texts, the Hindu sacred writings. But you're also dealing with this language, Pali. Pali, and Pali is a dead language, just like Sanskrit is. Nobody speaks these languages anymore, either Sanskrit or Pali, at least not in the everyday. Obviously, Indian scholars do, scholars of India and the Hindu religion and the Buddhist religion do, but they're like Latin. Okay, they're dead languages. No one speaks Latin, classical Latin anymore, and no one speaks these. So Pali is a dead language which is related to Sanskrit, part of the same language family, the Indo-European language family. Pali was not the language of the Buddha, but it is the language that was used to write down his teachings. So a lot of the earliest Buddhist writings and a lot of the writings from Buddhism that have come down to us and passed into other cultures were written down in this language, Pali. We have some written in Sanskrit as well, but Pali seems to be the dominant language. So, sometimes, and it's spoken a little bit differently. Things are pronounced a little bit differently. So, for example, Dharma in Sanskrit, but Dhamma in Pali. And I'll mention some of these differences as I go through with the terminology. Sometimes I favor the Sanskrit word just because it's traditional and it's come into English in that way. And other times I will use the Pali word, and I'll mention that when I do that, just so you know. So it can be a little bit confusing because you're kind of switching between, code switching, as they say, between two different languages, although they are related languages, but they're different. Okay, so the Dharma. Okay, I mentioned about about the fact that the Dharma, as we know, is an extremely multivalent term for the dynamism and the power for the dynamism giving inner power and quality to life. In Hinduism, it's equated a lot with the physical laws of the universe, but also principles and aspects of the world and humanity. So the four elements of earth, air, water, and fire, colors and sounds, all these things can be considered part of dharma, the organic life in general, consciousness. Okay. Um, and for Buddhism, the Dharma is in many ways more important than the person of the Buddha. Okay, the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings that he brought to lead to enlightenment, are really more important than he is. The Dharma is timeless, and following the Dharma is what leads to nirvana or to um, it's not exactly the same thing as enlightenment. It's the place where the enlightened go, or it's not even really a place, but it's a state of being, of pure consciousness, pure existence without any attributes is the best way I think it could be described, because ultimately nirvana is indescribable. What did the Buddha realize? What message did he bring? He brought the message of the Four Noble Truths, as they're called. And these Four Noble Truths constitute the core or the heart of Buddhist teaching. Remember, these are some of the things that the Buddha realized during his time of meditation or intense concentration under the tree, the fig tree. And when he realized the Four Noble Truths, he was like there. He was enlightened, awakened. What are they? Well, the Four Noble Truths are the knowledge of suffering, and maybe I want to, I guess I'll increase. Okay. Are the knowledge of suffering, the origin of suffering, the elimination of suffering, and the way to remove suffering. Or as it's translated in that kind of oldish translation I just read from for the parable of the arrow, misery is another way. Suffering is a way. Actually, really, the word that the Buddha uses in Sanskrit and also Pali doesn't really mean suffering or misery. It means more unease, instability. Okay, a person has a feeling or a sense of uneasiness about the situation of reality and their own situation. They keep looking for permanence and unchangeableness in a reality which seems to be not permanent, or actually is not permanent and is quite changeable. And that causes suffering or unease. And that's the first truth of the Four Noble Truths, realizing that realizing the universal human experience of suffering, of misery and pain that is caused by this unease. People know that the way they perceive and live life is unsatisfactory. It's as simple as if you've ever heard someone say, something's wrong with this, and they're talking about life in general, something's just wrong with life. There's something not right about this. And just about every religion addresses that question. There's something about human existence that just doesn't work in some way. And even if you're not religious, even non-religious people grapple with this question. Why is life like this? Why can't we just get along? Why are people like this? Why does the world work this way? There's a sense of unease about the situation we live in. The word for this unease is called dukkha, dukkha in Sanskrit. In Pali, it's dukkha. It's a little bit different. I'll write it down for you. In Pali, it's dukkha. Okay, it's a little bit differently spelled, but in Sanskrit, it's dukkha. All right? Or just say dukkha. I'll just say dukkha, okay? Which is the human experience of suffering or unease based on the impermanence of reality, the changeability of reality. Reality, whether good or bad, is changing and impermanent. This was the Buddha's realization. Both pleasure and pain are fleeting and temporary. We might feel good, but we don't feel good always. It's not eternal. We feel good momentarily. And we also feel pain or suffering momentarily. Sometimes people feel more pain than goodness. More pain than pleasure. There are people who live with chronic pain. They have nerve disorders or certain disabilities where, they just are in constant pain. Their nerves are very sensitive or overreact, or they have bad joints or whatever. And people spend most of their life experiencing pain. But nevertheless, even pleasure, when you can experience it, doesn't last forever. No one seems to experience pleasure as a permanent position. So these are all fleeting and temporary emotions or feelings that we go through. And they cause suffering, they cause unease. People suffer from people and things that are hurtful, certainly, but people also suffer from being separated from people and things they enjoy. Things that they enjoy can cause them suffering because eventually they'll be taken away. You might have someone that you love very much, and then that person dies. It's taken away. It's not permanent. So humans suffer. We're never fully satisfied, even with good things. Even good things can be overdone. Foods we like to eat, music we like to listen to, things we like to do, activities, but they can all be overdone. You can do them too much. You can eat too much and make yourself sick. You can be overactive and hurt yourself, strain a muscle or something. You can listen to too much music and lose your hearing. So there is a spiritual unease also at not being able to identify clearly who or what human beings are. And then finally, there's the ultimate suffering of complete loss and separation at death. So you see here, the Buddha was kind of working through the 4 encounters, or I should say the 3 encounters, seeing that, the people had sickness, people got old. Even if they didn't get sick, they got old, and people eventually died. People would die. But even when he saw the holy man in the 4th encounter, that didn't exist forever. Even the holy man had to leave his meditations, his sense of calm or equanimity, and do stuff. He had to eat. He had to go to the bathroom. The holy man could still get sick. Whoops. The holy man could still get sick, and the holy man would still die. So even the holy man would experience these things. So this realization of dukkha, of this unease. What is the origin of this sensation? What's the origin of this unease?
I wanted to see the world.
Oh, thank you. What is the origin? The origin of this, and I actually shouldn't have done that because I'm going to need to write something down, so darn it. The origin of this unease is what is called tanha. That's an important word to write down. A definition of tanha is craving, desire, wishing. And that is the origin of suffering. So we realize first that human existence is universally an experience of an unease about our existence. And the origin of that unease, it has a cause. And the origin of it is called desire, tanha. Okay. And this is based on the effects of karma, okay? Based on our human desires, which cause karma, because our desires lead us to do things which create good or bad karma. We have desire or craving for wrong things a lot of times. But we also have desire and craving for things that are right or good, but we crave them in the wrong way. And for the Buddha, he realized that the origin of this suffering was humanity's misplaced sense of value. That we place, the sense of value that we give to things that are unworthy of ultimate reverence or of ultimate dependence for existence. All things are fluctuating. All things are in flux. So nothing has nothing nothing has any dependence in and of itself. Everything depends on something else. So there's no sure foundation for anything in the universe or in reality. And yet we desire to find this foundation. We desire to find this permanence. And that's what drives us crazy. That's what causes us to suffer. Okay, so that's the origin of our suffering, tanha. The next stage is how to eliminate it. Is this suffering eliminatable, one might say? And the answer is yes. Okay, so we realize that the human dilemma is solvable if we eliminate or remove tanha, desire or craving. If we extinguish our desires. And by extinguishing our craving or desire, we will break free from samsara, from the endless cycle of death and rebirth, and we will enter into what is called nirvana. We will be free. We will be liberated. Okay, I won't say that. Which leads us to the fourth noble truth, which is the removal of suffering. Is there a way to remove suffering? And the Buddha tells us, yes, there is. It's not easy, but it is possible. And that's the fourth noble truth, that there are practices of removing desire and hence removing the unease that desire causes for us. And so it's a matter of knowing the ways to remove desire and craving, a misplaced sense of existence for things that really don't exist or have their own true existence. And the knowledge of this is to know the pathway to achieve this. And that's the knowledge of the marga, or the way of the Noble Eightfold Path. Just to show you here's a picture of the Buddha in parinirvana, where he's sleeping. I think I told you that this is where. Well, I'll tell you because I might have screwed it up when I told you last time what parinirvana is. But this is the entrance of the Buddha into nirvana. That's where parinirvana is. It means full nirvana. Remember that once the Buddha reached enlightenment, he was, I guess, technically in nirvana, but he still appeared to be physically present. And so he was still walking around for a number of decades after this, after he reached enlightenment, under the tree and teaching people and doing, appearing to be human. But once he died, that's where he enters parinirvana, or full nirvana, which he was already in. So this is represented by the Buddha lying on his side, going to sleep. Okay, I read that to you. Okay, so we have the Noble Eightfold Path, or we'll come back to this, as it's called. It's called the Ashtangika Marga. Ashtangika Marga. Ashtangika means eightfold, from the word for eight in Sanskrit. And Marga, we might remember from Hinduism, means a path, a road, a way. Okay? When we talked about yoga, remember we had the Tree Marga, the 3 pathways to moksha. All right? And so this is the pathway, the Noble Eightfold pathway towards release, called the Noble Eightfold Path, or the pathway for the noble ones is another way to translate it. And the Noble Eightfold Path is the fourth truth, kind of outlined for you. Okay, this is what you are supposed to do. It's the Buddha's teaching on which lifestyle one should lead, that will lead to liberation. And sometimes the Noble Eightfold Path is called the middle way, or described as the middle way, because what the Buddha learned from his previous attempt trying to be a Hindu holy man, and that not really working for him, was that the extreme really didn't work. You didn't want extreme pleasure, because he had lived that as a prince. But also, and that didn't solve his questions for life, that didn't give him satisfaction, but he also didn't find satisfaction in extreme denial, the extreme asceticism that Hinduism posed to him or gave to him as the answer, because he didn't feel that led him to enlightenment either. So there must be a middle way, a way of avoiding the extremes in one's lifestyle and seeking enlightenment. And there are 8 of them. Okay, which we have right here on our PowerPoint. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, the word here that is translated as right is a Sanskrit word, which I'll write down for you, samyak in Sanskrit. Samyak. And is translated as right, but really what samyak means is it means more in the sense of complete or perfected. So another way, maybe a better way than the traditional way of translating these terms would be complete understanding or perfected understanding might be a better way to describe it than right or understanding, because people might understand that, no pun intended, in the sense of correct, as if there's a right and a wrong. And that's not the question here. It's completed understanding. Your understanding has become perfected. And these 8 things summarize the process towards enlightenment and nirvana. And I should say it's part of a complex whole. The Eightfold Path is only part of it. I think when I was doing my research and reading stuff, I think there are like 37 limbs, as they're called, of this pathway, of which the Eightfold Path is part of it. So there's a lot of work to do. It's not this simple. I'm simplifying what is a really complex process. Yeah, I mean, something I guess I'll mention later when I talk about the 2 forms of Buddhism. But remember, Buddha established really a monastic movement. His movement was very monkish. It was not for just regular people. Okay, he was not a common man who was bringing a common message. He was bringing a message to people who would, as they enter into the Sangha, the community, and it was kind of like you had to become. Well, it wasn't kind of like you did by becoming a disciple. You entered into the Sangha. Okay, and the Sangha was like a monastery. You lived like a monk. You committed yourself 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 some days a year to seeking enlightenment and nirvana by following these various practices. Okay. And most people couldn't do that. Most Buddhists don't do that. We have 490 some million Buddhists in the world. They're not all monks and nuns, because most people cannot follow this way of life. It's very difficult, just so you know. So that's something about the reality of the religion, that it's not really a people religion like some other religions like Islam or Christianity, not so much Judaism, but Hinduism, yes. Do you have holy men and women who go off on their own and seek enlightenment or salvation on their own? Yeah, because you have monks and nuns in Christianity. You have people who kind of live kind of an ascetic life in Islam, not so much in Judaism, yes, to a great extent in Hinduism. But for the most part, they're people religions. Everyone is expected to live the religion. This is not possible for most people in Buddhism. For the monks, it's also very hard. So there are different rules we'll see for the monks and for just regular people who are disciples. And there are different levels. There are the disciples, who are most people, but then you have those who are pursuing enlightenment, who are the monks and the nuns. Okay? So it's a very complex, lengthy process. You probably will not reach enlightenment in this lifetime. You'll probably have to come back in another lifetime, almost certainly several lifetimes, maybe many lifetimes, thousands of them. So anyway, okay, the first I'll give you a little description of each part of this process. The first one is traditionally called right understanding, or another way to translate it is the complete view. And right understanding is the recognition of the Four Noble Truths. You meditate on them, you think about them, and you come to ever more and more understand them, their correctness, and how the world is like what they say. And it gives you the correct perspective of reality as having no underlying substance. There is really one thing I'll hammer away at, is and it's something that's the essence of the Buddhist teaching and of Buddhist teaching in general, is that there is really no solid foundation to anything in reality or the universe. And understanding that is enlightenment, or at least you're on the way to enlightenment. The second part of the process is right intention, or could also be translated as complete resolution, resolve. And this is a mental attitude of goodwill, peaceableness, or peacefulness is another way of saying that. But being peaceable, your character is peaceful, nonviolent. This also applies to non-attachment, or having a lack of craving or desire for the impermanent world, and therefore having the right intention based on the right view. Your intention is right because your understanding of reality and what really matters is correct and right and complete. Next, we come to right speech. And these next three are important. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And I should say that the Noble Eightfold Path is not necessarily taken as a sequence of things. Like first you have to have right understanding, then you have to have right intention, no, actually, because 3, 4, and 5 here, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, should really precede all the other parts of the Noble Eightfold Path. You should be speaking, acting, and living already in an enlightened way, according to the Four Noble Truths, before you attempt these others. Okay, so it's not a sequence necessarily, because 3, 4, and 5 are probably more important, which I would say more important, um, in getting started on the path than the others. So, right speech. Your speech must be wise, truthful. You shouldn't tell lies, but you shouldn't also gossip about people, because that's holding on to, why do people gossip about other people? Because they want to make themselves feel better or superior to the other person. Oh, did you see what she's wearing? I would never wear that, or did did you see what he did? I would never have done that, So it's very egotistical. Like it's important to build up your ego, which doesn't exist, by the way. So your speech should reflect that. You shouldn't gossip or tell lies. Your actions should also reflect that, and therefore a complete action should reject all moral behavior that threatens or harms human life. Murder, stealing, adultery, those things that cause harm to other human beings. Why? How does this follow? It's very good. It's a really good intuition by the Buddha, and really demarcated Buddhism from other religions like Hinduism, for example, where certainly fighting was necessary. It was your dharma if you were kshatriya, if you were part of the warrior class. Killing was your duty. You had to do it. But for Buddhism, no, it was not good, because you're wanting, if you're, again, it comes back to egotism. Why do you murder another person? Maybe because they've done something to you. So you murder them. You want something from them, their money or property or something that they have. So you murder them, you kill them. Or they're trying to kill you, so you value your own life. Well, the valuing of life or other stuff or things that might cause you to kill somebody, again, these are impermanent realities. They have no underlying foundation. So it's a false egotism. It's a false craving for your own respect or your own life or for other people's money or property. So you shouldn't, no. So it follows that you shouldn't harm or kill them, because to do so is a form of exercising your ego, or seeing that there is a reality to the world that really isn't there, because money passes, and property, and it's not really worth it. So harming human life. Um, this leads to the Shilas, which is well, I thought I would get to in the next PowerPoint, but I guess I didn't put it after this one. Let me get to the next PowerPoint slide. Okay. The Shilas, which Shila is a Sanskrit word which means a rule. It's also translated as precept. And there are 5 essential rules for followers of Buddhism. The Panchashila. This is from, I believe it's from Sanskrit. But notice Pancha is 5 in the language. And think of a pentagon, which comes from Greek. A pentagon is a 5-sided figure. It comes from the Greek word pente, and pancha. So notice they're related words because they're from the same language family. So pancha, 5, and then shila means a rule or a precept. And so there are 5 basic rules that disciples of the Buddha are supposed to take and to always follow. And these will be part of following right action. And they're here on a stone in Lumbini, Nepal, where supposedly the Buddha was born. They wrote these down in English. I don't know if there are other stones in other languages, but I found this one. Someone took a picture of it, so you can see the copyright there. I give credit for it. I observe refraining from killing any living beings. Okay. I observe refraining from taking what does the owner not give. All right. Kind of tells me the person who carved this into the stone was maybe not a native English speaker. I think what he or she meant was taking what the owner does not give. I observe refraining from committing sexual misconduct. I observe refraining from telling lies. I observe refraining from taking any intoxicant or drug. Okay, so those are the 5 basic rules of a disciple of the Buddha, which you should observe. And of course, these are open to interpretation. You have to, for example, committing sexual misconduct. What does that mean? Probably, certainly means something like adultery, probably, that having sex with someone who's not your spouse. But could that be extended to same-sex activity? Would that be considered sexual misconduct? Taking any intoxicants or drugs. I mean, does that mean not taking medications for an illness? Is that a drug that's forbidden? Is it all drugs, or is it just recreational drugs that are forbidden? The first Shila about refraining from killing any living being seems to make every Buddhist a vegetarian. So you're not a vegan, though. It doesn't seem to exclude eating eggs or cheese or whatever, but certainly it makes you a vegetarian because you can't kill a living being, so you can't kill another animal or any other thing to eat it. Okay. Now there are 5 extra rules for the monks. There are 10 rules for the monks, only 5 rules for those who are disciples. But once you become a monk, you have to make 5 more promises. And these 5 more promises are, I was going to write them down, but maybe I'll just tell them to you, and you can write them down yourself. There we go. And you can write them down yourself. The extra 5 rules, if you are a monk, a committed monk, the first rule after that, in addition to the 5, is that you can eat no solid food after noontime. Okay, so you can eat breakfast and you can eat a very early lunch, but after noontime you can't eat any more solid food. 2, no frivolous entertainments. So you don't go to the movies. You don't, I don't know, watch cartoons. I don't know, doodle. No frivolous entertainments. 3, you can't wear perfume or wear jewelry. All right. 4, you're not supposed to sleep on a raised, soft bed. Okay, so you sleep on the floor on a mat, basically. You can't sleep in a raised, soft bed. And 5, you can't use money or valuables, something equivalent to money. So you don't touch money. Which is interesting because I wonder how like the Dalai Lama travels around because he's like all over the place, jetting around places. So who's paying for the airplane ticket, you know? But anyways, these are the rules. These are the ideal. I mean, there's always a way to get around every rule. um, okay, and then number 5 is right livelihood, which means that one's business or way of earning a living should not cause harm to others. So if you're a disciple of the Buddha, you wouldn't be a butcher because Panchashila number 1, okay, says not harming or killing any living being. You're not going to be a pharmacist if you take drugs to mean even medications. You're not going to be a tavern owner where you're selling beer or wine, because that's an intoxicant. So that would, affect the livelihood that you would live. Right effort or complete effort means you want to create good karma, and to do that you should do good things. So it's a basic ideal, which is to do good and avoid evil. Okay, you find that throughout most religions. Do good things and avoid bad ones. Okay, so you want to create good karma, build up good karma. So what do? What kind of efforts are you making? You want to develop noble thoughts. For example, thinking about the 4 noble truths, thinking about the transience of life, its lack of foundation, thinking about reality as it really is, that certain things, or all things, don't really matter ultimately. So you develop noble thoughts and words and actions to ward off delusion, the delusion that there is a real universe out there, a real reality. You have right mindfulness. Mindfulness is a big one. And I honestly, I don't know how schools get away with this, having like mindfulness classes or stuff like that for students and stuff like that, because it's taken directly from a religion, which is Buddhism. I don't get it. But anyways, I'm not saying that mindfulness is wrong. It's a helpful practice. It seems to be actually a psychologically healthful practice, okay, because psychologists have started to study these things. Interestingly, they don't study Christian meditation, but they'll study yoga and they'll study Buddhist, Hindu yoga, and they'll study Buddhist mindfulness. But Christian meditation, for some reason, is a little too religious for them, I guess. Anyways, but mindfulness, you've probably heard about this. Now, what is correct mindfulness or complete mindfulness? It's the careful consideration of one's motives so that you don't give in to desire or craving, so that you recognize that your desires are delusions. And this involves meditation, and this is what people will do with mindfulness training and stuff like that. They'll tell you to try to, quiet your mind, or just let thoughts come into your mind and identify the thoughts or the feelings as they come in, and then let them go and let them come back. But, just like you're not judging the thoughts or stuff like that, but you're just identifying and categorizing them, your emotions, your emotions and whatnot. But also, and that's a simple way of practicing Buddhist mindfulness. But it also involves not just feeling your body. I should say that's another part of it. People will say, feel your body, be aware of your breathing, be aware of your heartbeat. If your stomach grumbles, let go with that. You want to feel every aspect of your body and your feelings in your mind, but also concepts that come into your mind. Because for Buddhism, they, especially a large number of Buddhists, they want you to realize that all is empty of existence, even the mental concepts that are coming into your mind, because they're not coming from Buddhism. They're not in the Buddha. They're not coming from anywhere. There's nothing that exists that actually is actually generating them. They're just kind of free floating there. Okay, it's almost like if you look in a fish tank and you see little bits of food or bits of stuff, floating around in the water with the fish, and they kind of come together and then they go away. And it's kind of like the same thing that's going on in our mind, in our body. Our blood is flowing, and sometimes you might feel a little pinch of pain, another time from a nerve, or other times you might feel that your stomach grumbles or that you have gas. And these are all just going on. And they're not going on for any purpose because they're all transient. So mindfulness is kind of gearing you or priming you for recognizing that all of these things are impermanent. Your bodily actions, your emotions and feelings that flit through your head as you're trying to meditate, and that come into your head and you kind of let go and you categorize, but also your mind itself and your mental concepts are all impermanent. There really is nothing there as the basis for them. There's no something that's thinking or feeling, is what mindfulness is kind of leading you towards. Then finally, we have right concentration or perfected concentration. And this is where the rubber really hits the road. This is like intense meditation. This is intense, single-minded concentration that is practiced in order to free someone from everything that holds that person back on the quest for nirvana. And this involves meditation or dhyana. I might have given you this word already when we talked about Hinduism, but I'll give it to you again. Dhyana, which equals meditation. It's the Sanskrit word for meditation. It's also called, I believe from Pali, jhana. Okay, it's jhana in Pali, I believe. It's the same thing. It's meditation. And this is an extremely, in Buddhism, it is extremely complex scheme of practices at 8 different levels. And it starts with focusing on form, but leads eventually to consideration of formlessness. Okay, so for dhyana and right concentration, this is where you usually see a person with the legs crossed in the lotus position. Okay, the eyes are about halfway open. They're not fully closed, actually. If you watch, they're halfway open, and you find a point. That's why it's intense concentration. You find a point or an object on which you concentrate and focus all your intention, to the point where you can create mentally an exact reproduction of that object in your mental state. And then you can do things with it in your mental state. You play with it in a way. You extend the object to the size of the universe and stuff like that. How do you do this? I don't know, because I'm not a Buddhist monk, and I'm just reading descriptions of what people have experienced, but this is how they describe it. So you start with a form, but about halfway through, you get rid of the form. You even eliminate the form that you've taken into your mental state, to where you get to just the perceiving mind, to formlessness itself, where there is no form. And then eventually you even get rid of the perceiving mind, because that's not really there, according to the Buddha. And there's just pure conscious existence, one might say, which is everything and also nothing, because it's everything. When if everything is everything, then everything is kind of nothing either. If every human being is really, if everything in existence or in the universe is X, and X is everything, there's really nothing. Because there are no true humans, no true animals, no true stars, no true dark matter, no true dark energy, no true black holes, because we're all the same thing. So they're really nothing. We're all the same thing, is kind of like where this is going. So ultimately, right concentration leads to where there is no conscious ideation at all. There's no creation of any mental concepts at all. The person has transcended beyond concept or thought. And so there's no perceiver anymore. All is nothing. All is emptiness. Okay. We can kind of see, if we look, the a connection to the tree marga of Hinduism. If we go away. If we look, the three margas of liberation of Hinduism. Remember, there are three. There was knowledge, there was devotion, and there was whatchamacallit, karma, action. All right. And some might also throw in yoga. Okay. But it's the tree marga. And here we kind of see the same thing. The three margas in action in a Buddhist key, one might say, with a Buddhist flavor. You certainly have action, karma, because you have morality and ethics. You have speech and action and right occupation. We certainly have knowledge, with right knowledge and having a right attitude or right intention. But we also have mental discipline, which I guess you could say is devotion. Maybe that's what's lacking here, is devotion. But right effort and mindfulness, right composure and stuff like that. So yeah, it seems like the Buddha is kind of reinterpreting the tree marga into the Noble Eightfold Path, which I find interesting. I also find interesting that this picture that's been here, you see it's a Greek-style bust of Buddha from Afghanistan. Yeah, the Greek, people knew about the Buddha and Buddhism, and in fact, there was a Greek empire that was all the way over to modern-day Pakistan, right on the border with modern-day India, and they were called Indo-Greeks. These were Greek culture, but they were living in India or part of the region of India, and they knew Buddhism and they reverenced Buddhism. Apparently, they respected the Buddha, and so you find a lot of statuary that is done in the style of Greek statuary, all the way from Greece, from Eastern Europe. In Asia, and this is an example of it. This head bust. And in fact, if we go back to one of the first PowerPoints, this statue of the Buddha from Gandhara, Gandhara is our earliest statue, our earliest representation of the Buddha, of Gautama Siddhartha. And it's Greek in style. It's not Indian. It's not Indian or Pakistani or Afghan. It's of the Greek style, the Indo-Greek style, which is very interesting. So they recognized him as maybe even a god figure. Because you find other stuff as well. They did statues of their own gods and goddesses from Greeks as well, but they certainly recognized that the Buddha was a holy man, a good and holy man. And maybe if I think about it, I'll tell you the story of Balaam and Josaphat, or Barlaam and Josaphat, when I get to it. Maybe if I think about it later. I don't want to talk about it now. Well, maybe I will. Let me see what the time is. Oh, it's been an hour and two. Okay, so I will conclude with this little story, because we're coming to the end of the lecture. But just to show this connectedness between religions and between cultures, and here, these pictures I'm showing you are actually not Asian. They're from Greek culture. In the region of India, of course. But we have a story of Barlaam and Josaphat, which was an old story that was told in Christianity about this guy who was a prince, and he was predicted, to be a wise man or a great ruler. And the father tried to influence him. He didn't want him to become a holy man, but and this guy, I believe Barlaam was the prophet and Josaphat was the guy. I get them confused. I forget exactly which was which in the story. I'm trying to think. I think Barlaam was the Buddha, or was the guy who was supposed to be the holy man. Anyways, and Josaphat was the prophet who predicted. Anyways, so it sounds familiar, right? Like the story of the Buddha. There was a prediction that he would be either a great ascetic or he would be a great ruler. And there was the same story of this man who was going to be either a great Christian holy man or he's going to be a great ruler. And of course, the father wanted him to be a great ruler, but he ends up becoming a great holy man. And this story found its way. This is actually the story of the Buddha. Okay, but the names have been changed, and the story found its way across from northern India through Syria into Europe, into Eastern Europe, and into Christianity. And people thought that these guys were real characters. I mean, obviously, Gautama Siddhartha was a real historical figure, but they thought these were real Christian characters. And so they thought they were saints. They were holy men, that Barlaam was a holy man. And so they even found their way onto the Christian calendar and were celebrated as saints by Christians and were prayed to as saints, as holy men by Christians. And it was only much later, like in the modern period, that in analyzing the story, scholars are able to compare and say, wait, this sounds very similar to the story of Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, you know? And what they think happened is that the story of Gautama Siddhartha was Christianized somewhere along the way, and it passed into the Christian mind, and people recognized the goodness of this man, and they started to venerate him and honor him as a Christian saint. So it's interesting that Christians for centuries were apparently honoring the Buddha as a Christian saint, not realizing it, but honoring him under this name of Saint Barlaam, and honoring certainly his life and his story in this story. Until, of course, they found out that it's probably the Buddha, and so, I think that put the kibosh on Saint Barlaam anymore as a Christian saint. But anyways, but it's just very interesting. It's a very interesting interreligious story and it reminds us of what we learned about the Catholic Church and Catholic teaching when we studied this in the beginning of the course. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions or in other religious figures. The Buddha seems to have been a good and righteous man. Some of his teachings are certainly good and righteous. I don't agree. I'm not a Buddhist. I don't agree with his teachings, like on the impermanence of reality and the fact that there's no ego and that nothing has a foundation in reality, in existence. I don't agree with him on that, and I don't necessarily. But I think there's wisdom to what he teaches, and so I can take from the wisdom of what he teaches, and even some of the Buddhist practices, and take the truth that's in them and apply it to my life as a Christian and see how they might enrich me as a Christian. Just as Christians before were enriched by the story of the Buddha, although they didn't know it, in the story of Saints Barlaam and Josaphat. So I'll leave you with that. And we'll come back to Buddhism on Thursday. So, because I think I've my time. Yes, God bless you all, and I'll see you later.